What did Jesus say about the end times? This question first came to my mind when I was a teenager, and I'm sure you've asked it yourself. But before I begin, friends, please like, share, and subscribe as it really helps this channel. All right, now back to my own embarrassing end times moment that will help us answer this critical question. Have you ever found yourself in the middle of your own overreaction? Everyone has, right? As a young person, I wasn't as acquainted with the Bible as I am today. Things, however, were about to get real. One night, I spent some time reading Jesus' promise about his return on the clouds of heaven. Have you ever read that passage? Well, to me, it was pretty spooky. Then, to make things worse, I spent an entire night reading the book of Revelation. Big mistake. I was hardly able to sleep that night. The thought of beasts rising out of the sea, a worldwide dictator who put his mark on people, and a time of trouble on the earth such that the inhabitants of the world have never seen, left me shaking beneath my covers. Amidst this state of mind, the words of Jesus weighed heavily upon my heart. Several times in the gospel accounts, we read of his saying that he is, quote, coming on the clouds, with power and great glory to judge the living and the dead. As I looked at the overcast sky that morning, I couldn't help but wonder, could this be the day? To my delight, I arrived safely at school, mentally and bodily intact. I know, I'm crazy. Feel free to mentally mock me. Believe me, I'm judging my childhood self at this very moment. Okay, so now that I've got some 30 years of experience, I'm going to step out on a limb and say that Jesus wasn't coming on the clouds at that very moment back in the mid-1990s. That being the case, what did Jesus teach about the end times? Well, here you go. Certainly, the Bible clearly teaches that Jesus will return visibly and bodily. The apostles also clearly believed, in my opinion, that the church would be triumphant in the world, discipling the nations, fulfilling the Great Commission before Jesus returns, and that his return would be accompanied by resurrected believers, the rapture of the saints, and a renewed creation. And again, the time leading up to the end will see the salvation of ethnic Israel and a falling away of the Gentile nations. I think that's what Paul meant by Israel experiencing a, quote, partial hardening until the fullness of the Gentiles have joined God's family. Okay, but was Jesus talking about these same events in places, for example, like Matthew 24, where he mentions false prophets, famines, and wars, among other things? I only ask this because I get the impression he was preparing his immediate audience for something they would soon experience. At least that seems to be the most natural way to take his this generation statement, something I'll explain more about in a moment. Here's what I'm getting at. Whereas Jesus did speak of the end times, he wasn't always speaking about the end of time. So often when we think he was talking about the end of history, he was actually describing the then coming end of the Jewish age with the destruction of the temple by the Romans in 70 AD. Yes, this was a huge event for Jesus' immediate Jewish audience, and there are many striking similarities between what he says in his end times sermons and the Jewish war of the first century. In terms of Jesus' end times teachings, there is no greater example than the Olivet Discourse. It's called that because he spoke to his disciples and others on the Mount of Olives just outside Jerusalem after they asked him when the destruction of the temple would take place. The bulk of the Olivet Discourse is located in Matthew 24, though Mark and Luke have parallel accounts. There, Jesus told wild tales of famines, wars, tribulation, false prophets, and, of course, his great cloud coming at the end of the age. So when people talk about the end of the world today, this is one of those passages they most often reference. They do so telling us that our world is currently plagued by all of these things and that the end must be right around the corner. Again, it's not hard to speculate that the end is near. I often wonder the same thing. But is the end of history actually what Jesus is talking about in the Olivet Discourse? I don't think so, and here's why. Have you ever heard of an idiom? Well, good, because idiom is also the answer to our opening question. What did Jesus teach about the end times? A working definition of an idiom is a figure of speech used by a people group that carried its own meaning different from the inherent value of the combined words. Okay, I know that might sound a little confusing, so let me give you an example. Ever said, "I'm starving"? What you mean isn't that you are literally on the brink of death. You mean that you are very, very hungry. We do this all the time. Likewise, I've got a lot on my plate doesn't actually have anything to do with how much food you have in front of you. In reality, it means I'm very busy. Well, a person from a different time and place may misinterpret our idioms because our world is alien to them. In the same light, we need to be careful when jumping into a biblical text written to an ancient culture to determine meaning for ourselves. In the case of the New Testament, we are nearly 2,000 years removed from the cultural expressions and idioms used by its writers. One major thing I was missing the first time I read the Bible was that coming on the clouds is a biblical idiom pointing to something entirely different. Yes, Jesus will return one day on the clouds of heaven, just like he went up into heaven when he inherited his kingdom. That's what the angels said in Acts 1:11. That's what Paul seemed to think in 1 Thessalonians 4:16. Jesus' cloud coming in Matthew 24 might even be an indirect foreshadowing of what we'll see at the end of history, kind of a secondary fulfillment. But what was the original meaning to his immediate audience? I think you'll be surprised. Let's take a closer look at the passage in question. In Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31, Jesus said, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." Yes, to a first-time Bible reader like me in the mid-1990s, this would naturally seem like the end of the world. Again, many of us look at the world around us and assume this will happen in our lifetime. That was my assumption. That's why I looked at those ominous dark clouds with such suspicion that morning. But before you jump to conclusions, try comparing Scripture with Scripture. Maybe there was something else going on in that passage. I think a little backstory will add some clarity. In Isaiah 19:1, we read, "An oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them." These words, written about 800 years before the birth of Jesus, show us something interesting. For starters, I think it's pretty cool that God didn't mean he was going to hitchhike his way down to ancient Egypt on a billowy haze, bearing a lasso and six-shooter. Instead, he was simply saying through the prophet that he was going to judge pagan Egypt. The Lord coming on the clouds is an ancient idiom that goes over our heads. I think that biblically literate believers listening to Jesus would have got the message loud and clear. What Jesus was saying was that he was the cloud-riding Israelite God, and that he, Jesus, would soon be coming in judgment on God's people for their unbelief. This idiom was used regularly in Old Testament prophecies. Check out Micah 1:3, for example, where God used this expression as a warning about his coming judgment of Samaria. In Joel 2:1 through 4, a day of clouds and thick darkness signifies God's judgment on his people. Psalm 104, verse 3, pictures him as riding in a chariot of clouds judging creation. In Jeremiah 4:13, he came to the nation of Judah on clouds as they were conquered by the Babylonians. And in Ezekiel, we read concerning Egypt, "For the day is near, the day of the Lord is near. It will be a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. A sword shall come upon Egypt. When the slain fall in Egypt, and her wealth is carried away, and her foundations are torn down." And later, "I will blot you out. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. All the bright lights of heaven will I make dark over you, and put darkness on your land." As you consider all of this, I think it's most reasonable to say that when speaking of his own cloud coming, Jesus was really referring to an imminent time of judgment coming upon the land, a time of great tribulation. This tribulation was actually spoken of long before his time by the prophets, and that tribulation did happen within the lifetime of his, Jesus, hearers. That time of judgment was the systematic destruction of the Holy Land by the Roman armies, culminating in the desolation of the Jewish temple and the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This severe retribution was the result of their hard-hearted rejection of God's Son. Yes, in case you didn't realize it, the Old Testament prophets spoke in similar language about the Roman conquest of the Jewish homeland many centuries before it happened. So understanding Jesus' prophecy actually gives closure to the Old Covenant and paves the way for the church's current global mission, something the Old Testament prophets also talked about. When you think about it, I'm sure those listening to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount of Olives understood his use of language, at least those who knew him. After all, with his next breath, he said pretty clearly, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." Yet for some reason, statements such as these by Jesus and the apostles have led many liberal scholars, because they don't understand the true meaning of Jesus' cloud coming, to scoff at them, the apostles, saying that they mistakenly believed that he would return within their lifetime to end history. Did you catch what I said there? Misunderstanding this idiom has actually caused skepticism about the Bible and led to unbelief in the world. No joke. This was a big issue with the biblical critics of the 19th century. And some skeptics still say the same thing today, even in, quote, Christian circles. So what is a generation? I ask this because the key to unlocking Jesus' Olivet Discourse is verse 34, as Jesus laid out his generational timeline. Ironically, opposite today's liberal scholars, many premillennialists will force a very non-literal interpretation on this verse. Yet both groups totally ignore prophetic language in the Old Testament. The skeptics just don't care, and the literalists will suggest, well, you know, in Scripture, a generation could last as long as 1,000 years. Now, call me crazy, but even by those standards, the shelf life of Jesus' prediction would have long passed. For crying out loud, we are now living after the turn of the second millennium. But don't worry, it gets better. Other premillennialists who want to hold to a more natural 40-year generation while still futurizing the passage teach that the doomsday clock began again with the birth of the modern nation of Israel in 1948. No, I'm not making this stuff up. And please don't think I'm mocking here. I'm really not. What I'm asking, however, is that if you hold this view, you take a step back and give a fresh look at your own claims about this text. Not so surprisingly, when the world didn't end in 1988, many of those who originally made this claim continued to change the definition of a generation, suggesting it could be as long as 100 years. Still others say that this generation referred to by Jesus in Matthew 24:34 is really the generation of unbelievers who will always be around until his second coming at the end of time. Again, I'm not trying to be critical here. The reason I'm telling you this is to demonstrate the absurdity of what many people teach so that you don't get swept up in the madness. On the one hand, premillennialists will also dogmatically demand that we be more literal. Yet when it comes to their definition of a generation, they are as free as a bird. In reality, all these loose interpretations of a generation fall dramatically short of the plain meaning of the word in the original language, as it would have been understood by its original hearers. In fact, the general meaning of the word generation does not change throughout the Bible. It always refers to the generational lifespan of those living contemporaneously with one another in time, usually about 40 years. Ironically, the period of time lasting from the time Jesus uttered those words, around 30 AD, until their fulfillment in 70 AD with the Roman conquest and the judgment of apostate Israel, was 40 years. I hate to get too literal, but when Jesus said, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place," I think he meant it. I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me. But what are your thoughts? Leave them in the comments. And if you haven't done so already, please like this video. I'd greatly appreciate it. God bless, friends. And as always, it was great to gospel with you.